Hello and welcome. My name is Joe Cutrufo and I'm the Communications Director with Transportation Alternatives. And I'm happy to welcome our panelists for tonight's session, Victim Blaming, How Media Narratives Can Undermine Efforts to Eliminate Traffic Deaths. We're joined this evening by our moderator, Angie Schmitt with 3MPH Planning, who's also the author of a new book called Right of Way. We're also joined by Ron Snyder, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief of the Kings County District Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, New York. And he's leading the new Street Safety Bureau for that office. We're joined by Arthur Chen of Fox 5 New York. Arthur's a newscaster here in New York City. We're also joined by Dr. Kelcie Ralph, who is on the faculty of the Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And we're also being joined by Nickya Wittington, who is a member of Families for Safe Streets in New York City. Angie, I'll let you take it away.
Hi, thanks for that nice introduction. So like Joe said, I'm an author of a new book. It's called Right of Way, and it was just published by Island Press in August. And it's sort of a deep dive into what's causing what I call the pedestrian safety crisis in America. So a sustained 10-year increase in pedestrian deaths. Pedestrian deaths are now about 50% higher than they were 10 years ago. And one of the things I get into a lot of depth about in the book is this issue of victim blaming and sort of how we respond when someone is hit by a car. And I think it has to do with a lot of social factors, power, political power, even racism sometimes plays into it. How we're going to start off this panel is we have a really great panel with a lot of people who bring sort of a diverse perspective, and they're each going to explain how they come to this issue and how their work is helping address this problem. And then we're going to sort of open it up to a discussion and get some questions going. We'll start off with some questions from within the group and then open it up for questions from the audience. Maybe next we could go to Kelcie.
Sure. Thanks, Angie. Let me go ahead and share my screen just to have a little visual to talk through some of the basics of the sort of patterns that we have today in crash coverage. So this is a summary of work that I've done with amazing colleagues at Texas A&M, that's Tara Goddard, and folks at Lyme as well. But so I just want to lay the foundation for what crash coverage in the United States looks like today. And basically, there are two consistent issues. One that Angie mentioned is that at a sentence level, our news coverage tends to shift blame towards the pedestrian. And also, we tend to see that we're framing crashes as isolated incidents. And I'm going to talk about how both of these two patterns really create this pedestrian crisis that Angie was mentioning. So I should say, in doing this work, we looked at 200 news articles from across the country. We're not picking on any particular jurisdiction. But so let's dive into each of those two issues. So at a sentence level, coverage consistently focuses on the victim. And I'll talk about what that means in just a second. It often omits an agent entirely, and it tends to grant agency to vehicles rather than to drivers. So let's look at each one in turn. When I say that we focus on the pedestrian, I mean at the sentence level that the pedestrian is the star of the show. They have more, or we say something like a pedestrian was hit or a pedestrian was hit by a car. We know from decades of research that the focus of the sentence is the person who gets the most blame or attention. And in our news coverage, we see that 3/4 of coverage tends to focus on pedestrians. So this is very commonplace. The next question or the next issue is that we tend to use non-agentive language that lacks an agent or actor. We say a pedestrian was hit, but by what or by whom we don't really know. And this is a problem because it obscures the role of a human actor, and then we can't hold anyone responsible. Fully 1/3 of the coverage lacked an agent whatsoever. In fact, many articles about crashes never mention the driver at all. A third sentence level issue is that we tend to use object-based language. We say a car jumped a curb, a car hit a person, and that again obscures the role of a human actor who we might want to hold responsible. In our survey of 200 articles, we found that authors refer to a car 4 times more often than they refer to a driver. And until we have an autonomous vehicle future, it seems a little premature to me. The good news is if we change those 3 simple things, very, very small, easy, cheap changes, we reduce blame on the pedestrian by 30% and see a direct shift to increase blame on the driver. Now, I want to be really clear here. Our goal is not to increase blame on the drivers necessarily. We also know that there's a road system that leads to all kinds of speeding, and it's going to definitely lead to crashes. So really, we're interested in shifting blame towards the road system. And to do that, we need to talk about that second issue that I mentioned. And that is that in framing an article about a crash, we have 2 different options. We can use episodic framing, which means it's just a single incident. It stands all on its own. Or we can use thematic framing, which means that we're going to identify connections between this specific crash and all other crashes. We can do that using crash statistics by describing the characteristics of the location, mentioning that this is part of a broader safety issue, as Angie mentioned. Now, the problem is that in our review of coverage, articles almost never use thematic framing. Just 16% of them used any thematic elements whatsoever. Not a single one of the 200 articles we looked at quoted a transportation expert or advocate. And so we're really missing the connected public health nature of these crashes. Again, when we include this kind of information to readers, we see really dramatic increases in the amount that people are willing to blame other factors. So not the pedestrian and not the driver, but rather road conditions. And my favorite part of this study is that they were less likely then to support individual level solutions, things like education campaigns, and were far more likely to support sort of broader public health issues like lowering speed limits, installing pedestrian infrastructure. And so the sort of promising takeaway is that while coverage is not great today, a couple of really, really small changes can dramatically improve coverage. So that's the sort of background foundation. And I really hope that this starts a good conversation about what we can do to make these changes more possible or more widespread.
Awesome. Okay. So over on the media side, we have Arthur from Fox 5 in New York.
Hi guys, thanks so much for having me here. Thank you to the Transportation Alternatives, and thank you to our my corporate Big Daddy company for allowing me to be here. I really appreciate that they understand the importance of this. For me, this is an issue, and what Kelcie just put into words is really helpful. Those slates were really helpful. This is an issue of bias, right? When we look at victim blaming and we look at the roots of it, I did a deep dive into my own work and that of my market, being New York City. There is an issue here that I think is worth noting. Victim blaming is being seen as a media issue, and it is. If we go back a step before that, how the media reports has a lot to do with what we are told from an official capacity. If we lay accountability with anybody, we're trained to label that. You know, if somebody's a suspect, police say they're a suspect, right? And in this case, the bias begins with, I think, a couple of things, inertia being one of them, but also a large part of law enforcement in New York City does not live in New York City. They drive in, right? And that causes a huge hurdle in understanding, because that's their bias, that's our bias. I have it in my newsroom. Those who drive into work routinely don't understand this issue the same way as those of us who live in the city, who are pedestrians, who are cyclists, and who also drive may see that issue. I'm going to share just briefly a couple of things that I collected. And before I do that, let me just point out my interest in this developed in 2006. On 3rd Avenue in Brooklyn, there was a 6-year-old boy who was holding hands with his babysitter. His dad's deli was across the street. The light changed, and it changed. It was clearly green, and he crossed out. He was hit by a truck that was carrying empty caskets. I happened to be in Brooklyn. I arrived very early on. I got 3 witnesses on the record, names, everything, phone numbers, who said the light had fully turned green and the kid stepped out and was killed. The police did not give that driver a single ticket. He was allowed to even drive away from the scene, which I think is I thought was shocking. A friend of mine who's passed away from a 9/11 illness was a detective on that case. And it's the only time in the 20 years I knew him that I yelled at him. And I was more like, I'm not proud of it, but I lost my composure. I was screaming at him. I was saying, how can this happen where somebody runs a red light and you're going to let this guy go? And he said, unless either a police officer witnessed it or the witness account of him running the red light can be coupled with him driving with a suspended license or without insurance. He said, the law says we have to let him go. It's an accident. I found that absolutely unacceptable. Andy Vega was the kid's name. He was 6 years old then. He would be 20 years old today when we had this conversation. Then in 2013, there was a case of Transportation Alternatives actually did a lot of work with, and that was Allison Lau, a 3-year-old girl who was crossing the street with her grandmother, was, and thank you to Kelcie, was struck and killed by a driver driving an SUV. That is one of the cases where victim blaming is used as an example. But I would point out 2 things. The first is the police officer who wrote up the initial police report said that the 3-year-old broke away from her grandmother's grasp, and thus this video was brought out, which showed from a dashboard camera of another vehicle approaching that intersection.
We know now that.
And I'm going to mute the audio here, but it showed that at no point did the little girl at the intersection let go. It was the first wheel, the front left wheel, that took the girl out of the grandmother's hand, and then the back left wheel. I'm sorry, this sucks to show you. And it sucks to be discussing this 7 years later and still feel like this is a fresh problem. But this was a police report that said that she was taken out of her grandmother's grasp, right? Not long afterwards, a very respected and not Ron's boss and not Ron's predecessor in a different county in New York, a district attorney decided not to file charges against the driver, who, by the way, had an alcohol content level in his blood, but it did not reach a particular level for criminal liability. Not only did they not prosecute him, but the 2 tickets he was issued were ultimately dropped. That's all I'm going to show. I have plenty of other cases, and unfortunately, we all know them. But I want to remind myself, even today, how much of a problem this is for us. The charges against the tickets, the 2 summonses, eventually were actually dismissed: failure to yield and failure to drive with caution, even with that video out. I mean, that is just absolutely astonishing. So there's a huge disconnect here, right? And this is a case where a driver gets summoned, but there's no repercussion, right? And unfortunately, we come from a society of good conduct based on having to face consequences. In 2018, there was another driver, and this is my last example, who in Brooklyn hit multiple people in an intersection, including a Broadway actress and a 1-year-old boy, a 4-year-old girl. The 2 toddlers were killed immediately. And the mother died if memory serves, about a year later. That driver had 8 tickets within the 2 years previous to that incident. 4 were for speeding, and 4 were for speeding in a school zone. She was still allowed to drive. So the bias that exists is societal. It says it's okay. It says it's an accident. It says there are no repercussions. So when we talk about victim blaming in the media, it's important to get to our individual biases as journalists, reporters, but I think it's important to recognize that this comes from a place of higher authority. If we're told something is an accident, and in the bad reporting I've seen, they'll say, police say it was an accident. Can the reporting be better? It can, but in the day-to-day pressures of getting your story to print or on the air, we don't have enough of these conversations to address this. That's kind of where I sit on this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think with that, we should go over to Ron, who does represent sort of law enforcement in this discussion, and let's hear about how they're working on this in New York.
Sure. Thank you, Angie. Just want to say thank you to Transportation Alternatives for inviting me to appear on this panel. I'm honored to be here with all these other distinguished panelists. So how this topic relates to my work, as was announced earlier, I am a Deputy Bureau Chief assigned to the Street Safety Bureau. I am the primary liaison between my office and transit advocate groups in New York City. I also, because of my position, have access to high-ranking members of the New York City Police Department in various different units of the police department. So, I can tell you that I have had conversations with with these high-ranking members of the police department about this issue. It is an ongoing conversation. My unit, Street Safety Bureau was rolled out just July this past summer. This is one of the issues that we've been working on. I have discussed it with, as I mentioned, the New York City Police Department. And as you can imagine, the New York City Police Department is so large and has various units that deal with different issues. So I work primarily with the Highway Patrol and the Collision Investigation Squad, who are primarily responsible for investigating crashes involving pedestrians and cyclists. This particular issue also hits on the NYPD Transportation Bureau and the press office at the NYPD. So, my direct contacts are in the Highway Patrol and the Collision Investigation Squad, and through them and through the Transportation Bureau, I'm working my way towards the press office. And once I can have a conversation with all of these people together, we can sort out, what ways we can improve disseminating information to the public about crashes. So, it is one of the things that we've been working on. And, I can tell you that based on the conversations that I've already had with members of the NYPD, they are aware of this issue. And I believe that they are genuinely sensitive to what the way things are reported, what, for example, pain it may cause to a victim's family to read particular details, the way they're reported in the press. So they are aware of this, and I am working with them on ways to improve how the information is provided to the media. It is extremely helpful to me to be here and to hear all these different perspectives, because it gives me an opportunity to think about things a different way, than the way I was thinking about them. So for the slides, for example, that Kelcie showed were really helpful. And the stories that Arthur is telling, they're really just heartbreaking. And, I deal with these issues on a daily basis, and the pain of seeing, people who are killed or injured in the street. It just never, for me, I never get numb to it. And I can relate to some of that, because I've been a cyclist in New York City for about 15 years, a bicycle commuter, which is one of the reasons why I was appointed to the Street Safety Bureau. I've been hit by cars, I've been doored, had hospital visits, et cetera, because of that. So I'm aware of, the pain that people are going through, and it is, something that I'm working on to addressing.
Thanks. I think we have one more person here who represents the families of victims. Nickya, is that correct pronunciation? Did I see? Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about what brings you to this problem, and a little bit about your background with this victim blaming?
Yes. What brings me to this problem today is the crash that occurred with my son, Siobhan Bethea Jr., back in May 26, 2018. When the accident occurred, I was told that it was under investigation. And then I received a call from the detective explaining to me, asking me questions 5 days after the incident. Questions like, were your son diagnosed with ADHD? Do you have any paperwork to let us know, to show us that he wasn't diagnosed with ADHD? And I felt as a parent, those questions were so inappropriate at the time, because all it did, it made me feel like I didn't want to be here no more. It put me in a more stage of depression, on top of the pain that I was already feeling, the emotions that I was already going through as a parent. I have other kids to raise, so I was trying my best to be strong for my children, and to also show them that regardless to what happened, we have to be strong as a family. And it will taunt me at night when I sleep, just the question that he asked me if my son had ADHD. I wanted to say today that no one knows the pain of a mother, a pain of a parent, a pain of, it could be anyone. No one knows what you go through. No one understands if someone is going through mental illness as a parent. And even though you're going through mental illness, it doesn't define you as a parent. And if someone loses someone tragically in a crash the way I lost my son, I want to know if it's okay to say things like, well, I'm sorry, ma'am, your son was the one to be blamed. I'm sorry, ma'am, I think your son had ADHD. These are things that is not, it's just not okay. It's not okay. We have to take into consideration feelings. We have to take into consideration how that person is coping. We cannot just say things. Our words are very powerful. And when we say things to someone that's going through trauma of that sort, it could cause even more damage. So I wanted to read a poem that I wrote today, and I would like to share this with you guys. I wasn't ready to say goodbye when you got your wings and decided to fly. I am trapped by my love and my grief. I know this pain will never leave. Move on, some may say, but it takes only a second for me to remember that one tragic day. My son was 7 and he just wanted to play. He did not know the danger that lays in the roadway. He's my angel now watching over me. We lost our loved one to these streets. And I say that to say this because when we lose someone once again, in the manner that I lost my son, I cannot speak for other people, but I can speak for my pain. And with the things that were said to me by the detectives, which were blaming my son for the crash. If he did not know the danger, if he did not know the outcome of something, and if someone don't know, how could they be blamed? So I just feel like it's imperative that we really put a stop to this, and we could do something about it by enforcing the laws and trying to make better, better decision, more resources, and be able to assist families with the right help that they will need in the time of grief and the time of a tragic loss.
Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I want to thank you guys for allowing me to speak today. And I also want to thank Family for Safer Streets, because they've really been the backbone of support system for us. And me being a parent, still going through the grief, still raising my kids. It's not easy, but I would like to be a voice for my son. I would like to be a voice for all the people that we lost to these tragic crash.
Yeah, thank you again. That is really powerful. One thing we wanna go back kind of through the panelists, and I want to start with you. You're, as you mentioned, a member of Families for Safe Streets. What is Families for Safe Streets? Are they involved with this new effort in Brooklyn to change the way police are framing and investigating these crashes? And if so, what are the group's recommendations?
I would say what they do is they really assist with resources that you wouldn't just get from, no one really gives you the resource that you're really looking for. But with Family for Safer Streets, they put resources in place. If you need therapy, if your family needs any type of assistance, they try their best to get you that resource. And aside from the resources, they work very hard with putting together new ways of how we can come together as a community to change certain laws for these crashes. Because once again, I would say we lose people to these streets every single day. Every single day. You watch the news, someone is getting run over, someone is being killed by, it could be a bus, a car, a truck, you never know. And when you're going through something so with that amount of trauma at that time, you can't focus about, funeral arrangements. You cannot focus, too much on certain things. But with Family of Safer Streets, they have so many resources that I myself, it was valuable to me and my family that we were able to get the assistance that we need, with our voice being heard as far as the injustice that happens with these crashes.
Okay, thank you again. Just to bring a couple more voices in, and then we'll go to audience questions. I wondered if Ron or Kelcie or Arthur, if you have recommendations about policies that you would like to see implemented, or you think that would have an impact, and whether that's like an internal newsroom policy or something that could be implemented at the police level.
So,
go ahead.
Please, Arthur, go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Ryan. First of all, I would point out that Ron's office is the first to have somebody in his position. So that's extremely valuable to the city, and maybe something that other district attorneys' offices can bring on, because it directly also addresses bias within an office. And I think that's the key for the police department. Like I said, the vast majority of police officers who are going to come to a scene are ones who drove in to work that day. Their perspective is different, and that needs to be addressed. Now, Transportation Alternatives created a 15-minute film that they show taxi cab drivers, I believe. And instead of it being a voluntary thing, I think that it would be really interesting for police officers, especially ones that would arrive at the scene, to understand a little bit more of what parents, such as Ms. Wittington and others that we've discussed, what they go through, and to better understand the issue. So I think that bias has to be attacked at its root level from the very first person that arrives at the scene. And then with the media too, I think accountability and our biases have to be examined, where we look at, I have my perspective because I walk around the city, because I was born and raised here, because I cycle from time to time. So I see all three corners of that triangle, and I think it's really important to get others to see it too, but also to ask politicians, do they understand this issue? If we're going to talk about policy, they're the ones who've got to lead the way, right? So maybe grading politicians on how well they understand these issues. And us media folks, we're very receptive to what's going on. It's our job to feel. And as such, we can be sensitive, right? And so if we're reached out to on social media and called out for reporting that can be improved, you better believe you'll have the attention of whoever it is that you're addressing. And I'm sorry, Ron, you were going to speak.
Thanks, Arthur. Right. So, one way I look at this is that, this particular issue is very challenging for law enforcement, because I think, especially the police department, has to deal with competing interests. So as a public agency, the police department has an obligation, I believe, like all public agencies, to be transparent to the public. And oftentimes when these incidents occur, there are calls, within just a few hours or the next day for the arrest of a driver. And I think that the police sometimes feel pressure to release information that would mitigate their not arresting anyone at the scene or within a short time after. Oftentimes, these types of cases oftentimes are very complex. With a car involved, there's issues of perhaps of mechanical issues, speed, traffic lights, weather, blind spots, distractions. There are many issues that detectives who are investigating these cases have to work through to complete their investigation. So with this with transparency and to provide some explanation for perhaps why someone's not arrested at the scene or a short time after, I believe that these create competing interests for law enforcement. So one of the ways that I thought about this in trying to make the situation better moving forward is, for example, if a detective speaks with someone at the scene, a witness, for example, who says that, I'll just use a hypothetical, that a cyclist or a pedestrian was walking against, pedestrian walking against the light, or a cyclist going through a red light. Would it be helpful for the detective to put in his or her preliminary report, that information is being provided by one witness? I think there's a substantial difference. If, I can't help but read newspaper articles as a lawyer because that's how I'm trained. But if you're even a member of the public who has no legal training, if a news report says that one person saw a cyclist go through a red light at the scene, or 5 witnesses say they saw a cyclist go through a red light at the scene, I think it makes a substantial difference, because I think, we've all read stories about how, sometimes eyewitnesses don't get it right. What they saw is not exactly what happened. We see this in the issue of misidentification, in robbery cases, burglary cases, et cetera. So if you provide the public with more details about who's providing these, these details about the incident, it, I think, will help the public decide whether something's credible or not. If something's being reported by one witness, okay, maybe the witness is right, maybe the witness is wrong. If 5 people or 8 people or 10 people say the cyclist went through the red light, I think, anyone would be able to say, well, Matt, that's 8 people. That must be what happened, right? So you're able to use the information that's provided to you to make a judgment about credibility. Surveillance video. Is the information that the police are giving to the press on surveillance video, is the surveillance video clear? if we give more background about where this information is coming from, I believe it would be helpful to the public in, for themselves, the reader or the viewer of a news report, to make that judgment on their own. And I think that would be helpful to this issue and trying to get clarity on this issue and try to improve it. So
before I have some things I wanted to say, but I kind of want to ask a question there. When you keep saying we, do you mean Arthur and his colleagues in the press, or do you mean the police? Because it strikes me that.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question.
Do you mean, who's the we? Is it the press or is it the police?
So I'm speaking from a law enforcement perspective.
Okay, good. You sort of switched between tones in the middle, and I was like, gosh, that's a lot of responsibility for Arthur and his colleagues to take on. When it strikes me that at the end of the day, it's the police's responsibility. So I'm glad I cleared that up.
Right. So if I just to clarify, I think so it's confusing. So I believe, one way to address this that I've thought of is to work with the police to provide more information about where these details are coming from. Provide this information to the press so that they can report it. So, is this detail about someone walking against the light coming from one witness or 5 witnesses, or is there video, those types of things, which then the press can use in their, either in their, print report or in their news report on the television or radio, et cetera. And it can give the public more information about what happened and allow them to, make their own judgments about credibility, et cetera. So.
Good.
Yeah.
Thanks for clearing that up. That's really helpful. In answering your question, Angie, my goal is to make both Arthur and Ron unemployed eventually, in that I don't want anyone reporting on crashes, and I don't want Ron going to the scenes of crimes or of crashes to report on what's happening. And I think the motivation for my research team was that we see so many people dying and getting killed in crashes, but there's no sustained public outrage, right? It's like the same as a 747 falling out of the sky every 3 days. And we just forget about it. And mothers and families are suffering in isolation and no one cares. So for us, we didn't start with our eyes set on the media. We set on why is it that people are not connecting the dots between these crashes? And the media is obviously one part of that story, and that's the primary way that the public learns about crashes. But I want to be really clear that we are also interested in how the police talk about these issues, and have attempted to present this work to police conferences, and so far have not been able to do so. So Ron, hopefully you and I can talk after about ways that we can get this research in front of police, because it's so vitally important. And of course, they've got 100 things to worry about. It's not top of their radar. As traffic safety advocates, it's the top of our radar, and we just need to connect those dots.
Thanks. Yeah. I was a reporter for a little while at newspapers in Ohio, daily newspapers. And we had this convention that I think is sort of problematic, where we were trying to do reporting about every fatal car crash. And it was often just very, very superficial. There would be a paragraph or two, and it would be 100% based on a police report. So I wonder if it's time to revisit that sort of style of reporting, and I don't know if Arthur or Kelcie would want to weigh in on that, what might be a more effective way. And maybe, Nickya, maybe you would have, I don't know if you had the experience of seeing your son's death reported on, and what that was like for you as well.
Could you hear me now? Yes. The way it happened is he went away for the weekend. And when I got the call, to just to tell you to get to the Bronx, your son died, is the most tragic thing to receive. This is the most tragic thing to receive. And when I got to the Bronx to identify my son's body, and I saw my son laying there. The only thing kept me from, like, just it just kept me from coming out of character the way I was more angry and enraged than sad. And when I saw my son and I saw the bruise on his face, this really huge bruise on his face, and he had this little smile on his face as well. He didn't have a sad face, he had a little smile on his face, and that allowed me to be able to stand there with a little more strength to face my son. The way I was handled by the police, I just felt like it was so disgusting, and it was never highlighted. No one never looked into it. Mr. Um, the Brooklyn Borough President, Mr. Eric Adams, was the main person who reached out to me and said he agreed with the way they handled me. It was not right. They told me several stories that did not make sense. They told me stories before they even had certain evidence, and the other detective was say to me, Miss Wittington, I don't know why Detective Troy was share that with you, but we don't have that, that information as yet, so we can share with you. So I will wait and I will wait and I will wait, and I would just hope one day that they can give me the answers that I'm looking for. I just want to allow my son to rest in peace. I just wanted the answers that I was seeking as a parent, for closure, just to understand how my son died. Any parent that send their child away and the child don't come back, I mean, you don't know that pain until it knocks on your door. And the way I was handled, it was just very, very, very inappropriate in the time that I was going through what it is I was going through. And I wanted to say this to you guys. The detectives, yes, we know they handle a lot of these crashes. Yes, we know they handle a lot of these cases on a day-to-day basis because people die every single day. But they need to make a change with the way they handle them, the way they handle the families. It is not fair to us that we receive certain, I would say backlash, because the way they talk to us, they know we're grieving and we just want answers, and they talk to us in any manner. That's what I've witnessed and I've experienced as a parent. And I don't think any parent should go through that, especially in a time of need when you should feel a little more love. In a time like that, you should be feeling a little more love and support than you feel like the world is against you. And that's how I felt. I felt alone. I felt like the world was against me. No one understood, because I'm trying to figure out why no one is covering this, why no one is even trying to look into find out what happened to Siobhan. My son's life mattered too. Just 2 years. It's been 2 years. And I had to go through the same experience. Just the only difference is I did not lose my other son. My other son was hit by a van on the 23rd of December last year. And I had to relive that moment all over again. Just getting the call on his birthday. He went to the store with his uncle, and I got a call that I have to come outside. He got hit by a van, my other son. So I didn't live it once, but I lived it twice. I'm thankful that my son is still here. He's still breathing, and he just came out with a couple of fractures. It's just a matter of how they handled it. They turned their cheeks the other way.
Well, thank God. Thank God. That's terrible. That's terrible. I wonder if do you think it maybe, I don't know, has the police department ever considered, it sounds like maybe having a social worker or liaison involved might be a little bit better for the victims' families. I don't know if that's something you would support, or something the police department has ever looked at.
I would support if they can have like certain resources put in place to speak with the families or to deal with the families, a special unit to handle the families, because we cannot have, we're not saying all officers is going to do the same thing, because you have officers that will handle a family with the utmost respect, but you do have officers that handle us with no care in the world. And it leads you to either two things: depression or suicide, because that's where I was as a parent.
I wonder, sorry, it ties in a little bit to what Kelcie was saying about how the public views these as so routine. Maybe that's the way police feel about it too. And then there's an enormous disconnect when they're like, this is a routine thing I have to deal with and move on to something else. But then when you're a family on the other side of it and you've lost your son, it's this enormous trauma.
Yes. Then you understand the trauma that it caused, not just you, but your entire family. It didn't just cause me trauma, but his siblings. You know, I go through this every other day, you know, with them, just trying to teach them how to cope, let them know it's going to be okay, let them know that they always ask me, Mommy, why is no one doing anything? Why is it okay that our brother died the way he died and no one cared? Because this is how it looks. It looks like no one cares because you're going through it and you feel like you're going through it by yourself.
And if I can add something here, and thank you again, Ms. Wittington, for sharing such a personal tragedy of yours.
Yes.
We're leaning a lot into, when we talk about victim blaming here, we're leaning into institutions, whether they be media or law enforcement. And I think it's important to point out from Ms. Wittington's experience that this is a massive problem, right? And for Kelcie not to be able to go and present her research in front of police departments, that's I don't understand that hurdle, because New York City, our homicide rate is pretty close to the rate of traffic deaths. So if we want to take something seriously, even with a department that has 100 things to do, your second biggest killer in the city is something that you want to take a hard look at. So if we want to make Ms. Wittington's share actionable, I think it's to remind the public that this is not a single act. You know, Transportation Alternatives has done a great job reframing this as an accident here, an accident there, that it's a policy issue. But I think it's to really blitz that part of it. That might be the crux here. If, for instance, we put up a billboard that keeps a running number of people who are either critically injured or killed on New York City streets each year, if we have that board and that number continues to go up, I would think that enters the public conscience and it stays there, and people start thinking, holy shit, you know, we need to do something, excuse my French, but we need to do something to address this. And then if that awareness becomes, instead of an incident by incident sort of, oh, this happens every day, to a, hey, you know, what? This is happening, what? Then the policymakers, the people that I report to, that Ron reports to, they're going to say, oh, I have to find a solution for this. Let's talk. Then those people will go to Kelcie and say, can you show us your research? Instead of her shopping around, people should be going to her and saying, what have you found that's relevant to us finding a solution for this? So I think this has been useful if we are going to look for something actionable out of this, in finding a way to get public awareness, to understand that there's a massive amount of people getting killed, and it's a consistent issue that requires a policy remedy, whether it's street architecture or within institutions, whether they be mine or Ron's.
And that is such a good segue into answering Angie's question about, like, what is it harmful to have these like isolated articles about crashes? And I would say absolutely. I think the thing that the media absolutely can do is to embrace this thematic framing, once a month, once a quarter, doing these blitzes of, here are the faces and stories of these people who have died on our streets, and here is what these streets looked like. Because so often we would say, oh, this crash happened on this street, and you can just sort of assume that it was the person's fault by all the language in it and by just thinking about what they were doing. But then you Google Street View the place, and it's a giant arterial with, you know, 8 lanes and no sidewalk and no speed management at all. And so my challenge to you, Arthur, and all of your colleagues is to embrace thematic framing and tell these stories in a way that does lead to public outrage, because that's what we need you for.
Yes, I agree.
And you're on board already. It's just your friends we need.
A lot of people, we haven't really had a lot of questions come in, but a lot of people are just chiming in with support, especially for you, Nickya, and people sharing similar stories that they've been through. I wonder if I wonder if one thing that occurs to me is, is it an issue of resources? Like Arthur mentions, there's almost as many, homicides in the city as traffic deaths. They're roughly similar, but I would imagine that there's way more resources that go into investigating those kind of deaths. And I wonder, first of all, it sounds like there's a need for training, police training, which again, it may become a little bit of a resource issue. So I just wondered, Ron, if you could chime in about how big of an obstacle insufficient resources is to doing a better job on the police end.
Sure. I mean, I think that is the case. The way the NYPD is structured is generally there are 5 boroughs in New York City. Each individual borough has its own precincts, and then each borough also has its own homicide squad. So if we're comparing homicides to crash investigations, all of the boroughs have their own homicide squad. Brooklyn is actually so large, it actually has 2, Brooklyn North and Brooklyn South homicide. So we're the only borough that, I believe that, that has 2 NYPD homicide squads. So that's the homicide side of it. Now, as far as crash investigations go, there are highway patrol units in each borough, NYPD highway patrol units, and connected with those highway patrol units is a collision investigation squad, which is staffed by detectives who investigate crashes that are what we consider serious crashes. The collision investigation squad responds to any incident where someone has been killed, where someone has suffered serious physical injury, which is defined actually by the New York State penal law, or that person's in critical condition, and that's the medical term, critical condition. So, a doctor at a hospital has classified the victim or victims as critical, and the collision investigation squad will then take over the case. Those determinations are happening within an hour of the crash, so it all happens in real time, and a collision investigation squad gets involved at a very early stage. So and then responds to the scene. I think it's pretty clear that the NYPD spends more of its resources, financial resources, staffing the homicide units than it does its collision investigation squad. So I do believe that that's an issue for them. Unfortunately, I think just before COVID, the city had announced, the NYPD had announced that they were starting a Vision Zero unit to work towards the goal of Vision Zero. That has now been placed on hold because of budgetary constraints related mostly to COVID, which is affecting all city agencies. So, it is an issue, and it's great that you recognize that, Angie. It's one of the things that we've been working on with NYPD. My office is setting an example in that regard. We've reconfigured what we, previously called the Vehicular Crimes Unit. We disbanded that and now have the Street Safety Bureau, which is staffed by a number of assistant DAs and deputy bureau chiefs. And so we are, trying to lead by example in that regard. But at the end of the day, everybody has limited resources. So it's a question of how those are apportioned.
Okay, well, we just have time for one question, and one of the questions we got was, if there's members of that, does anyone do training for the press, and who are sort of the experts that people can contact it from the press if they want to get into more depth about this problem? And I would say, some of them are right here. Kelcie is a great source. She's at Rutgers. I'm sure she'd love to talk with members of the media. The folks at Transalt are experts, and the folks at Families for Safe Streets are another good expert as well. I think we sort of have to wrap things up. If we want to maybe do one last word, I'd pass it over to Kelcie. like, do you have a wrap up thought that you would want to leave people with at the end of this panel discussion?
Sure. Okay. I think big picture takeaways are that the words that we use to describe crashes matter. They matter for the families of victims. They matter for public acceptance of what we should do moving forward. We need to hold the lives of the people who will die in traffic crashes if we don't act in our hearts and minds every time we talk about this issue. I so enjoyed this conversation, and I'm looking forward to the productive discussions that are going to come out of this as well. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much to everyone, especially you, Nickya, for sharing your story. Hopefully we can do better for families like you in the future.
Yeah, yes, most definitely. My daughter's here. She wanted to say something to you guys as well.
That'd be perfect. We just have 1 minute left. Hi.
So I just wanted to give you guys my perspective of things. And I just wanted to thank Families for Safer Streets because they actually have been helping out a lot. And when I first heard about the situation, I was like really hurt because I was more closer to my brother. I was closer to Siobhan. And so as the years go by, it hurts me even more. And now to see that they're not, the people who's supposed to be helping is not doing anything is hurtful, because my brother's life mattered too, just like Breonna Taylor, just like George Floyd, he mattered too. So they should be helping us out also.
Well, you are a very brave girl, and I'm glad you jumped on. I really appreciate it. That's really important work you're doing. So I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. I did copy them, and I'll try to get them to the presenters, and maybe if they can track down the right people, they may try to follow up with you. Thanks again to everyone, and for Transportation Alternatives for hosting us.
Thank you.